Thank you, Chair. And I beg to move that this House has considered the UK's responses to international human rights abuses. And it's a pleasure to see you in the chair, Dame Maria. I'd like to start by thanking the many remarkable charities and NGOs that are working fiercely to protect the lives of oppressed people around the world, from Amnesty International to the British Red Cross to Human Rights Watch to Islamic Relief. Thank you. This is brave work in the face of terrifying opposition from terrorists, oppositional governments, and sadly sometimes from members of the Conservative benches. Last week in the Chamber, one honourable member slandered judges in the European Court of Human Rights by calling them non-lawyers, guided by non-governmental organisations, as though the work of NGOs is a scandal to be associated with, when it is far from it. So on behalf of those on my side of the House, I wanted to begin this debate by paying tribute to them. It is our duty in this place to work towards a world where their services are no longer needed. And sadly, we are far from that being a reality. This week, we will mark Holocaust Memorial Day in Parliament and our constituencies. It's a sacred and solemn moment in the year when we consider the depths of evil that can be reached by people in power. The regime of oppression against the Jewish people, as well as other minority communities, did not begin with the Holocaust, and it did not end there either. It's apt that alongside our commemorations, we consider ways in which we can intervene in present-day attacks on human rights, particularly through a proactive, fair, and importantly, consistent foreign policy. Absolutely. Human rights abuses are above and beyond the topic I receive the most correspondence from my constituents on. My constituents rightly care about the most vulnerable people in our town, but also across the world. I have received thousands of emails regarding the Gaza situation alone, so that is where I'd like to begin. We cannot allow the tragedies happening each day and night in the Middle East to fade from our minds. While rightfully condemning the brutal attacks launched by Hamas on October the 7th that killed and injured thousands of civilians in Israel, but our government was so shamefully slow to oppose the counterattack that followed, in which violations of international law were plain to see. So I want to ask, does the Minister regret his department's hesitation to intervene when the Israeli Defence Force were known to be withholding food, water and other essential supplies from desperate Palestinians? When aid routes were being blocked, I will give way.
Thank you very much to the Right Honourable Member, and congratulations on securing this very important debate today. I've recently put a question into the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office to make sure that the Department is constantly checking on Israel's engagement in the Middle East when it comes to Gaza and to ensure that it's complying with international humanitarian law. Does the member opposite agree with me that the Foreign Office has to be looking at this day in, day out, because many of our constituents across the country care about this deeply?
I thank the member for that intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree. I just wish that we had a Foreign Secretary of State that members of Parliament could actually question face to face rather than what we have currently, particularly in the volatile situation that the world is in. I want to follow on from those questions to the Minister. When aid routes were being blocked, hospitals were running out of fuel to treat victims, including babies, and requests to open the Rafah crossing were denied. All actions that were in direct contravention with international law. I would be interested to hear what corrections they would make to their approach, because it is not too late to learn from those mistakes, and I would strongly urge his department to do so. And as we have heard from all sides of the House, we deserve answers to these serious questions. What does the Minister have to say about the horrific ITV news footage which shows a man waving a white flag in a supposed safe zone being shot and killed? Will they be taking this to their Israeli counterparts, and when? The human rights of Palestinians have been systematically violated for decades, from the creeping annexations on the West Bank and settler violence to the 15-year-long blockade that shows no signs of weakening. But 2023 saw a deadly escalation in violence and deterioration in the standards of human rights in the region. The latest figures from Amnesty International tell us that around 24,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Gaza. Given half of Gaza's population are children, we can therefore estimate that well over 10,000 children have been victims of this conflict. This is a gravely conservative estimate. Much debate has taken place about whether the Israeli Defence Forces' actions have amounted to war crimes, I've made my views clear. We have seen collective punishment, arbitrary arrests, Amnesty report evidence of illegal airstrikes against churches and refugee camps. UN human rights experts warned in November of signs of genocide. And as we speak, South Africa are mounting a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice, which must be heard without prejudice and taken extremely seriously. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and was making an excellent speech, and it's a very important debate as well. I also find it shocking that when you look at all these facts, what is happening on ground in Gaza, it seems almost every rule of international in relation to humanitarians have been broken. We see that genocide case is being heard at ICJ, and yet our government cannot even call for a ceasefire. Is that acceptable?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he is absolutely spot on. I asked the Minister earlier whether he had regrets about his department's approach in the earlier stages of the most recent conflict. How long will it take for contrition to set in over their stubborn refusal to call for a ceasefire on all sides? How long can this government ignore all the warning signs of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians? And when will the self-reflection begin regarding our continued supply of arms to Israel? Far more is within our power to influence Netanyahu's government than ministers are currently taking. But we must also do what we can to encourage the release of hostages on both sides of this conflict and to lessen the number of Palestinian and Israeli civilians' casualties. Our approach to Israel must be in line with how we treat other countries. If a government says they are committed to human rights, they can't pick and choose which human rights we stand up for and which ones we do not. We should not overlook breaches of international law by holding some countries to a lower standard. We have imposed sanctions on Russia, imposed sanctions on China to address their abuses of human rights. Our government have also rightly sanctioned arms suppliers to the Myanmar military. I would appreciate if the Minister could divulge whether consideration has been given to similar action for the Israeli government. Consistency should be key in our foreign policy, but consistency is what we're lacking. Moving on to some other areas that I'm sure colleagues would agree deserve scrutiny. The people of Jammu and Kashmir continue their painful struggle for statehood. This is another area of international human rights that is close to the hearts of constituents in Luton North.
On that point,
I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend, the member for Luton North, and with regards to Kashmir, many of my Slough constituents continue to be concerned about the safety and security and well-being of their family and friends. Does my honourable friend agree that it is incumbent upon both the Indian and Pakistani governments to ensure that the human rights of all Kashmiris are protected and that there finally needs to be a resolution to this long-standing issue, which has the wishes, hopes and aspirations of the Kashmiri people at its very heart?
I thank my honourable friend for his timely intervention, and he is absolutely right. What happens in Kashmir is felt on the streets of Slough, on the streets of Luton, and in all of our constituencies. And since having their independent status revoked by India in 2019, the population of Jammu and Kashmir have experienced an intensive crackdown on their rights. I have heard countless shocking first-hand testimony of arrests, abuses, and violence against women and girls. Kashmiris deserve the freedom, safety and self-determination promised to them over 75 years ago as laid out in UN Resolution 47. Instead, they have been deprived of their rights of expression, their internet access is tightly controlled, they are arbitrarily detained, the Indian police force kills without accountability, and Amnesty reports that demolitions of homes in Jammu and Kashmir look likely. They live in one of the most heavily militarised areas in the planet. Will the Minister please tell us what, if any, dialogue is happening with the Indian authorities to address the abuses towards Kashmiris? And why is it this government has decided to include Indian-controlled parts of Kashmir on their safe list? The Supreme Court decision last year, which recommended the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, was welcomed by charities and NGOs in the human rights space, and rightly so. I'm sure the Minister would agree with me that this initiative could be powerful in bringing peace to a region as well as oversight. Will he commit to promoting it to their Indian counterparts?
The Honourable Member.
I will give way.
And the Honourable Member, thank you for giving way, and you have been generous giving this time. You mentioned the horrific human rights abuses that's been taking place in Palestine. You talked about Kashmir as well, and there are also issues in the Rohingya, with the brutal genocide in Myanmar, and the Uyghurs by the Chinese government as well. So the one thing all these examples have in common is that the abuses are largely being committed against Muslims for their Muslimness. So does my honourable friend agree that this is the worst manifestation of Islamophobia and prime example of what happens when governments are not held to account for their demonization of Muslims?
I thank my honourable friend not just for his intervention but for the work that he does on this space and for championing and fighting for recognition of a definition of Islamophobia in this country. This isn't just about holding our country and our government to a standard. This is also about fighting against and tackling state-sanctioned Islamophobia across the world. Last week, along with many colleagues, I attended an event by Open Doors UK, which highlighted areas around the world in which Christians are persecuted for their faith. One of the top 10 countries was Nigeria. And last year, the APPG of Freedom of Religion and Belief published a report warning that treatment of Christians was near genocidal. Sadly, other minority groups are also at risk of torture and death. One of my own constituents was forced to flee Nigeria after months of being on the run because of his sexuality. After managing to escape, the Nigerian authorities killed his brother for assisting him. Then they killed another family member when they would not reveal where he was. One would hope his arrival to the UK would grant an end to this trauma, but sadly, following his substantive interview, he had to wait over a year for his asylum claim to be granted. Another country on the Open Doors watch list for the persecution of Christians was China. I welcome our country's leading voice in condemning the horrors that the Chinese government have imposed on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We've been persistent in our opposition to the slave labour of the Uyghurs, alongside other atrocities amounting to ethnic cleansing. While it was unfortunate that the UK's resolution at the Human Rights Council narrowly failed, I asked the Minister and his department to continue their efforts to pursue independent mechanisms to investigate human rights crimes through the HRC. Jimmy Lai, a British citizen currently on trial under Beijing's national security law, could face life imprisonment for distributing a pro-democracy newspaper. Life imprisonment. Hong Kong Watch advised that this trial is partly based on the testimony of a witness who underwent torture while imprisoned in mainland China. I join Hong Kong Watch in calling on this Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary to raise Mr Lai's case and calls for his immediate release. Chair, Hong Kongers are not safe from the oppressive regime of the CCP at home or abroad. We have Hong Kongers seeking safety in the UK with bounties on their heads that ministers were reluctant to even meet. Here in the UK, we know of interference in our universities, violence outside embassies, and intimidation of Hong Kongers who speak out against Chinese state policies. I know the Minister will share my view that any infiltration from Chinese state agents in our public institutions and political establishment must be dealt with robustly. But we have a responsibility to protect the safety and rights of private Hong Kongers who have made our country their home. We also have a duty that proposed changes of our domestic law do not negatively impact our levers of influence. I am deeply concerned the government is failing to hear the Uyghur group's warnings that the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Bill will limit their own campaigns for justice. I will give way.
Way and also securing the debate. I just wanted to raise the case in Hong Kong of two of my friends and colleagues who've been detained for quite a while now. They're members of the Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions who we've worked with over the years in different disputes. The first is the chair, Carolyn Man Yi. She's the British Airways cabin crew worker who we worked with over in the major disputes out there. She founded the British Airways Hong Kong Cabin Crew Union. And also there's Lee Chuk Yang, who was the General Secretary of the Federation as well. Both have been serving time now, simply for being trade unionists and representing their members. And I think it's important that we ask the government to maintain the pressure on the Chinese authorities for their release.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention and wholeheartedly agree. Where we have seen people speak up for democracy, for workers' rights, for human rights, we need to ensure that they are safe to do so and that we continue to voice their struggle when they are voiceless. Chair, this is the tip of the iceberg internationally. If we were to cover the true state of human rights across the globe, we would be here all week. But I want to end closer to home, because we are far from perfect. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, there are 14.5 million people living in poverty in the UK, over 4 million of them children. It's not just standards of health and living that are failing, but also the erosion of basic rights, the rights to protest, a government seeking to override our own courts. We've seen that with the Rwanda bill, which was voted down in the other place this week. It's not just about the actions, but the inaction of this government that is weakening our reputation for human rights on the world stage. There has been cross-party condemnation on the weak response from the government to China, shock at the lack of any acknowledgement of human rights abuses in India during trade talks, Tory MPs even calling for the reinstatement of Donald Trump, the ex-president arrested on charges to plot to overturn election results. While we may look afar at the humanitarian horrors we see on our screens in our hands, we must be able to answer the younger and future generations who ask, what did you do? While also not turning a blind eye to the erosion of human rights happening in front of our eyes at home. From Luton to Lagos, Gaza to Kabul, Kabul to Kashmir. When people know about human rights abuses, they care about them. The peace, stability and safety of all is worth striving for, and we can only do that together.